Hello, I'm your instructor Bernard Norcott-Mahany, and we're going to finish Chapter 4 and move into Chapter 5. So this is Persephone, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, and Ares. The focus here will be on Persephone for the rest of Chapter 4, and then Aphrodite for Chapter 5. Hephaestus and Ares don't play really much of a role in the Chapter 5. So the Chapter 4.3, other Mediterranean works, so the comparison work, is a work called In the Desert by the Early Grass. We don't have the author's name. This is basically an anonymous author. It's an oral poem that's composed. This poem is difficult to read. It's got a lot of repetition. I recommend reading it aloud. And then as you're reading, look in those marginal things where the translator has basically sort of summarized what's going on. That'll help you follow the thread, because otherwise it's sort of difficult. Roughly, it involves two main characters, a character named Dutur, who is the mother in this story, and Damu. He's also called Dumuzi. He is her son. He apparently has died. And she then travels across some river, like a marshy area, to bring him back. And it's unclear if she's successful doing that. The poem concludes with, the selection at least concludes with songs of the reviving beer, which is somewhat interesting because in the Eleusinian Mysteries, which were the mysteries celebrated at Eleusis, part of that involved drinking some sort of grain beverage, so some sort of basically like a beer or an ale that may have had some mint in it. So the fact that this poem also makes reference to the mother brewing some beer, which supposedly will help revive her son. But again, it's unclear if she's successful in doing that or whether she has to accept the fact that he is gone. Now, the figure of Dumuzi, right? So Damu is also called Dumuzi. Dumuzi is equated elsewhere with a figure called Tammuz, and also with a Greek figure called Adonis, and he is a figure of a dying god who comes back. And in those stories, he's equated with the figure of Ishtar or Inanna, who's the Mesopotamian or the Mesopotamian goddess or Phoenician goddess of sexuality. So that's a different sort of frame, and maybe the Dumuzi there is not the same as the Dumuzi here, but there is a sort of similarity. Now, the end of Chapter 4, the Nachleben section, has three modern poems about Persephone. These are all by women authors. The Narcissus Flower by Rita Dove, Diary, Underworld, by Rachel Zucker, and Persephone in America by Allison Townsend. Now, a word of warning. The Narcissus Flower by Rita Dove is based on, so all these stories tell the Persephone story from Persephone's point of view. And in the case of the Rita Dove poem, she is basically comparing herself, all three in some ways are comparing themselves to Persephone. But in Rita Dove's case, one of the things she did in Europe when she was basically like a graduate student studying in Europe, she also served as a model for artists. And one time when she did this, the artist in question sexually attacked her. So that poem, if you have some history of sexual violence done against you, this might be a flashing point. So if you need to skip that poem, just skip that poem. So that's the word of warning. The Diary Underworld by Zucker takes a different sort of tone. The premise here is that Persephone's okay with being the wife of Hades. It was her mother's control on her that bothered her more. So that's a different sort of take. We only see in Homeric Hymn number 2 Demeter's side of things, and the description of what happens in the underworld is unclear, right? She eats some pomegranate seeds. Does she do that because she's forced to, or does she do that because she's tricked to, or does she just do that? And depending on how you answer that, that determines whether, in a sense, she's a willing participant, because the eating of the pomegranate seeds is symbolic here of her having sex. So once she does that, she then becomes the mate of Hades and does have to actually spend some time with him. So that's why she can only go back for some time. And the Persephone in America, sort of by Townsend, Townsend thinks of what she would do with Persephone, like when she was a girl growing up and she played with Barbie dolls, and then the Barbie dolls when she was like a teenager and you know, a young adult, she went to Woodstock, and so Persephone would also do that sort of thing, and she'd be wearing cut-off jeans, and she'd be wearing, you know, tie-dye clothes and that sort of stuff that's relevant to that time period. In her version, Persephone in America, you know, Townsend clearly is not bothered by this. She actually sort of enjoyed the experience of going out on her own, but apparently when she wrote the poem, her mother may have recently passed, and so there's a certain sadness because she can't really talk to the mother anymore. All right, moving into chapter 5. Chapter 5 is listed as being about Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, and Eros or Cupid. But it's really about Aphrodite, right? The other figures get short shrift. The literary selection is Homeric hymn number 5 to Aphrodite. So this is one of the 4 big Homeric hymns: 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we'll see all 4 of them in Maurizio. And they're all very good. I mean, of the Homeric hymns, they're easily the best. There were some shorter ones which are also quite good, but these longer ones are like mini epics. They tell a little story. So this tells the story of the love affair of Aphrodite and Anchises. Now, what's going on with the love affair of Aphrodite and Anchises? Well, Aphrodite is the goddess of love, goddess of sexual desire, and she is able to zap the gods so that the gods want to have sex with mortals. Right? So that's the setup. She goes around bragging about how she's immune to that. Right? She never has had sex with a mortal. She wouldn't stoop so low, but she makes these guys do it. Now, there are some goddesses who are exempt. Hestia, Artemis, and Athena are all virgin goddesses, so they're not having sex with anyone, so they're not susceptible. But the male gods are definitely having sex with mortal women, and Zeus is really sick of this because Aphrodite was basically bragging. He wants to bring her down a peg because he himself is being made to look ridiculous, right? He's basically being undermined by his, in this case, his daughter. Now, one of the things about this poem and about Homer is when they refer to Aphrodite, Aphrodite is the daughter of Zeus and not an independent agent as in Hesiod, where she comes out of the sea. So it's the same name, same area of control, but there's a difference because Hesiod's Aphrodite is much more impersonal, and this Aphrodite is much more, basically she's sort of a flirt. So there is that difference in tone. It also allows then Aphrodite to be under Zeus, and therefore Zeus's control is clear. And so Zeus makes her fall in love with this mortal named Anchises. And she spend one night together. She tricks Anchises, who does not want to have sex with a goddess, for the following reason: human males who have sex with a goddess generally end up impotent, and he doesn't want that. So that's the big thing that he's willing to worship her. He's willing to do all sorts of other stuff. She then gives a big cover story of how she's not a goddess, so she lies to him. They do have sex, and then the next morning she reveals herself to him, and then he is horrified and sort of angry at her for having tricked him, because now he thinks, now I'm going to be impotent, and she has to sort of calm him down. It's sort of a humorous poem. The tone is humorous. So I think you will like the poem. I think it's a more fun poem in some ways than Homeric Hymn Number 2 to Demeter. The scholarship in Chapter 5 contrasts with Chapter 4. So Chapter 4 argued, right, Helene Foley argued that myth and ritual reinforces social norms. John Winkler, in this article, which is about a festival in Athens called the Atonia Festival in honor of Adonis, another of Aphrodite's mortal lovers, who gets killed by a boar. He's a hunter. He goes out hunting. He gets skewered by the boar's tusk, and he dies. And so this festival, the Atonia, one of the parts of it was that on the first day, women would plant these seeds in particular soil, and the nature of the soil and the nature of the seeds is the seeds would spring up very quickly. So things would grow like within a day. There'd be growth, and then the plant would actually sort of grow, and it would look sort of like a male genitalia, and then after a few days there wouldn't be enough moisture and sustenance in the ground. It would then fall over or droop, and the women who were part in, this festival, the Atonia, was all women. The women would then laugh. And John Winkler's sort of question is, what were the women laughing at? What they were laughing at is that male sexual prowess, right? Guys are sort of tough and they can do all sorts of things, is short-lived, right? It goes up and then it goes down. Whereas women's sort of sexual identity and the motherhood thing sort of ties it into, it's a much more global thing. It's a much more powerful sort of image. And so Winkler's point is that this gives women a chance, women who don't have power, gives them a chance to basically sort of take power to themselves and to laugh at the men who lord it over them. Now, I think in the short term that's true. It does give that women the chance to blow off steam. In the long term, there's no change. It's not like women suddenly got power. Women have power for this 3-day festival, or they have the sense that they have power, but in reality they still have no legal status, so they don't have any real power. So in the short term I think it works. I don't think it actually overturns. It provides a safety valve so women can sort of get their tensions over this out. The Mediterranean work, the other Mediterranean work that we had here, is a poem called The Descent of Inanna. And this comes from 1800 to 1600 BCE. It's a Mesopotamian poem. Inanna, also called Ishtar, also called Astarte, also called Ashtar, is the Middle Eastern goddess who is equated with Aphrodite. And on Cyprus, the island associated with Aphrodite, all of these goddesses were sort of worshipped there. So there really was a lot of cross-cultural fertilization. The poem does not explain why Inanna is going to the underworld. One explanation is she is going to retrieve Dumuzi, her lover, but that's not stated in the poem, so it's unclear what the reason is. She may be just going to see her sister, who is the goddess of the underworld, so she's sort of like Persephone, but in this case they're sisters. It's unclear, but the point is, as she goes to the underworld, she has to go through 7 gates. And at each gate, to get through, she has to take off something she's wearing. So when she hits the first gate, she takes off her crown and she gives it to the doorman. She gets to the second gate, she takes off her earrings. The third gate, so after she's gone through the 7th door and she's in the underworld, she has given up all her clothing. And the clothing are symbolic of her power. And if you think of like how clothing can be very sexualized, you can see how that would be, that might have that effect. So by giving this up, she's lost power. And in the usual account, someone, in some cases it's Dumuzi, in some cases it's someone else, offers to take her place in the underworld, which allows her to go back to the land of the living. But she's powerless at when she goes through that seventh gate. And Dumuzi, of course, would be a god who dies and is reborn. He's an agricultural sort of god. So that would make some sense if he takes her place, which allows her to be free, but he'll go back to the underworld. And the last work, the last thing that we're going to look at is from chapter 5, is the Nachleben, the afterlife of the Pygmalion story, right? So this is called Pygmalion in Hollywood, and there's a brief description of 4 films that sort of tell a variation of the Pygmalion story. So, first of all, what's the Pygmalion story? Pygmalion in the story is a sculptor. He's an artist. He's a sculptor who lives on the island of Cyprus. Cyprus, of course, is sacred to Aphrodite, and the women of Aphrodite do something to anger Aphrodite. And she retaliates by making the women all sort of like sex crazed. So like they're having sex in the streets. It's sort of like Mardi Gras gone crazy. And Pygmalion is a rather shy and standoffish person to begin with. So when he sees women acting like this, he's totally turned off. He goes back to his studio. He sculpts a beautiful statue of a woman. And then he falls in love with that statue. So outwardly, he's shocked and horrified because he's sort of this very moralistic guy, but deep down, he actually has these desires which come out in the statue, which he then falls in love with. So it's sort of a weird sort of thing. And then he goes to the festival in honor of Aphrodite when it happens the next year, and they're all praying to Aphrodite to do one thing or another for them, and he prays, "Could I have someone who's just like my statue?" And then he goes back to his studio, and either right before his eyes or, in some versions it's already happened, his statue has come to life. So the Pygmalion story is all about a creator and his creation, and they fall in love, right? And that sort of changes the dynamic, right? The Pinocchio story would be a Pygmalion story, right? Geppetto makes this puppet, but the puppet then gains life. And when he gains life, of course, he's now an independent entity. He's not entirely under the control of his creator. So the first movie is called Pygmalion, and this is from the 1930s. It is based on a play by George Bernard Shaw called Pygmalion. It tells the story of a linguistics professor named Henry Higgins who adopts a Cockney flower girl named Eliza Doolittle, and he transforms her into a lady. My Fair Lady is the musical version of that story. So it's the same story, but turned into a musical. The third film on here is Pretty Woman with Julia Roberts and Richard Gere. That film, Richard Gere sort of is the creator, the Pygmalion figure. Julia Roberts is the Galatea, the statue that's going to come to life, because like in the My Fair Lady, he's going to turn this woman who's a streetwalker, right? She's a prostitute, into a lady because he needs a lady for his business meetings as an escort. But again, things get complicated because it turns out that Julia Roberts and Eliza Doolittle in the two earlier versions has a mind of her own and actually acts on that, so that then Higgins or Richard Gere's character have to then sort of learn to accommodate this. They fall in love with their creation, but their creation is also independent of them. So Lars and the Real Girl sort of flips this on its head. It's about a young man who is very shy. Something bad has happened in his life, and what he does is he sends away for one of those blow-up dolls, and then he treats the blow-up doll as if it is a real woman, and he brings this woman around with him. So like when he goes shopping, he's got this blow-up doll with him, or when he goes to the movies, he's got it in this seat next to him. And the people of the town love Lars, and so they go along with the fiction. But then Lars actually meets a woman that he actually wants to have a real relationship with. And so Bianca, the blow-up doll, then has to, something has to happen to Bianca. So I won't further sort of give you, because that's sort of a spoiler already, but if you haven't seen the movie, it's actually, when you first hear about it, it's like, that's sort of creepy. I don't think I want to watch that. It's actually quite a well-done movie. But there, in a sense, he's the frozen figure. He's the statue-like figure, right? He's not sort of emotional. But he learns to become that before the end, right? He learns to break out of his shell. So in a sense, Lars is sort of the Galatea figure, not the Pygmalion figure, because he doesn't actually create in any way Bianca. He sort of, I guess, pretends that Bianca, a doll, is actually a real person. But so that covers the end of chapter 4, beginning of chapter 5. So hope your reading is going well. Keep up on the bulletin boards, and I will see you next time.